Hi everyone, nice to see so many familiar faces. See a lot of painters in the audience, which is always good. Thank you, Hannah, for inviting me to come along this afternoon and to talk to you about the show and about your work. I thought that we might start off thinking about time. I know that time is very important, as it is for many painters, how time is held and contained within painting. So if we go back in time to 2017, I know that that was quite an important moment for you personally and for the work. And maybe you could just say a little bit about your circumstances in 2017 and kind of what changed for you.
So I'd moved back from Berlin in 2014, and I was living in the West Country and was painting down there in kind of quite a lot of isolation. And that was when Turps started up the surgeries, and I had a one-to-one with Marcus, and it kind of 2017 marks my beginning of my relationship with Turps, but also with Greg Rook and Tom and Shai Hall, who've supported this show. So I went to a one-to-one with Marcus, like really terrified because I hadn't spoken to anyone about my work, and you know, I had the sense of him as this formidable figure. And I think because I never studied painting, I never really had that validation of being a painter. And within our conversation, he gave me that validation. He gave me that validation in a very simple way, that he offered me to be in a show, which then morphed into the next stage of shows, which was the Women Can't Paint shows. So he kind of plucked me from nowhere. And in that first show at Turps, I sold a piece through Greg to Tom and Shai Hall.
And can you remember what your work was like sort of prior to that point, and what shifted through that first conversation, and can you see that in the work now?
I first painted in 2009. So I moved to Leipzig, I moved to Berlin, and I moved to Leipzig, and I had a residency at the Spinnerei. And when I was there, I think a lot of what's been happening in the show over the past few years, or this past year particularly when I've been making this work, is a lot of reconciliation of lost works, of invisible times, of being an invisible painter, in a very literal sense as well. These long canvases, those stretches, were the first canvases I stretched in Leipzig. I didn't know what I was doing, and I had this sense of this scale I wanted to paint on. And at that point, I outlined for myself quite a lot about this perceptual understanding of landscape, and then this very physical, present sensation about bodies. But I didn't have an audience, and over time, there are a lot of obstacles in life. And when I entered meeting Marcus and Turps, the body was really present in the work. The perceptual side had kind of dropped out. I couldn't find a place, I think, for understanding. Like I didn't feel almost like I should be doing the two together. And in that time, like about 5 years ago, I fell pregnant late in life, and I knew that I wanted to make a huge change in my work. I didn't know what that was. And then I had my child in 2019, and then we went into lockdown, and it was kind of a crazy time for a lot of people in different ways, but for me of real rupture. And there was a point where I couldn't even paint the body. I was painting kind of gestural landscapes, and I removed the body entirely. But in about 2020, I think it was like almost like New Year's Eve 2023, I had this vision of this figure, which was this woman holding this palette up. And I knew I had this urge to return to the figure, that I'd kind of return the strength of the body to myself. And that body was broken down and fragmented and exploding at the same time. And what happened in this last year was, prior to that, I did the show with Greg where the figure was very front and present, probably more like the painting More Than One Gold. So where there's less of a landscape and the figure occupies the whole canvas. Then around last summer, I thought, I've never really lived my life doing what people have told me I should do. So I wasn't sure why I was carrying this weight of, or this pressure that I should only be painting one thing or another. So I let the paintings come with this kind of the gestural abstraction, for want of a better word, as kind of perceptual space, and then allow these heavier weighted figures to occupy them.
You just mentioned the weight there, and it seems like there is a lot of weight that's being put on the figures themselves, especially with the two paintings at the back, where it's almost as if they are sort of quasi-architectural, that they are supporting the whole painting, because the figure extends from the top edge all the way down to the bottom edge. And then in these two, you mentioned the palette as a shield. I think when we spoke before, I sort of mentioned that in Dutch, the word for painting, and I apologise if anyone speaks Dutch fluently, and with my pronunciation, but I believe the word is schilderen. So in Dutch, schilderen means painting, and then the root of that is shield. So it's the painting as a shield. So in these, the palette becomes a shield, but it's also, a form of protection. It's a torso, and then maybe by extension, the painting becomes a kind of shield in a way, or maybe a form of protection, or there's perhaps something quite talismanic about it. Does that resonate in any way?
Yeah, no, I really like when you said that to me before. Like, I hadn't thought of it about the figure holding up the canvas, and when you're parenting, and I'd say particularly mothering, you're in such an intense physical state of holding up somebody else's world, as well as like that notion of painting that you're holding up you're always one moment away from collapse in a painting, aren't you? And perhaps almost always one moment away from collapse in the body, and yeah, that shield, that like the palette switches in different times, different meanings. And sometimes I look at it and it would change. And something like I'm looking at that one now, and I feel like it's almost like protecting the child from the world, because the world's beyond the window. But those aren't necessarily conscious. The one in More Than One Gold, when I originally did that drawing, the palette was blank, and there wasn't a body behind it. And when I painted it, it felt like a rebuttal. It didn't feel. It just felt like a picture, yeah. And I thought, well, actually, when you're painting, you're always painting with your body, through your body, and for women, our bodies have been the traditional subject, of being the paint, in a sense, being the paint that's been picked up off the palette for many years, hundreds and hundreds of years, and it made sense to make the body the palette.
So just thinking about what other things repeat throughout the paintings. We mentioned the palette and the shield, but there's also gold coins, pearls, there's still life elements. There's also this head, which we can see here. And I think it's in pretty much almost all of these paintings in some version or another. And that is Brancusi's Sleeping Muse. And maybe you could say a little bit about why that's been an important motif for you and for these paintings.
Well, I first painted that in, I think in Leipzig, or maybe it was in Berlin. Yeah, I think it was in Leipzig. So that would be 2009. And in the original painting I did, it was this very big head in the center of like a town square. So I'd taken it, this kind of sculptural form, and made it almost like this town square sculpture, and there were figures lying around. And I had this sense, it stands for dreaming for me, for like daydreaming, for like the potential of dreaming, the strength of dreaming, the interiority that painting can access, and part of that kind of reconciliation that I've been working with the paintings this year was to restore that to these paintings. So it's become, sometimes I think of it, like sometimes it becomes an object, and it's such an incredibly smooth, beautiful form, yet I do find that I often haven't painted it that smooth. And sometimes it's a mask, like a mask dropping, and it feels like a weight that you carry around. And that in the front room, it's in the back of a painting, it's on a boat. And I was kind of, maybe there's something, because those front paintings are the more recent ones, that maybe there's something where it's almost connected to a Sisyphean kind of task, the task of pursuing painting, of keeping going, of, like, I don't know if you remember, like the statues of the heads of, was it Lenin and Stalin floating down the river after the fall of communism, and that's, I don't know whether they're kind of carrying the fall of modernism along with them. I'm not sure, but all these different talismans, amulets, they become a bit like I felt like they're almost like worry beads, or things that I can. They become a kind of language of my painting that I can drop in, and they change the meaning, they change their purpose, they alter the coins. The coins came, like in that one there, she's tipping the coin to I, which was, I was thinking a lot about that invisibility as you age, particularly as a woman, as you move towards 50, and it's a very freeing sensation, but you also become very invisible, and I was like, there's this kind of, I just had this sense, just tipping the coin to her own eye, that there was a kind of self-immolation, but I specifically, they all became Boudica's coins. Like, I didn't really want it to be about a money exchange, more about some kind of artifact, and Boudica as a kind of foundation myth is a pretty strong one, how she, the various stories of her protecting her daughters in the face of great violence. And the coin then shifts, so at certain points it's in the child's hands. And I don't know, when you have a child, a lot of us face our own death in childbirth. I certainly did, but you also are really, your sense of mortality is heightened, because you suddenly see that, this child will grow and take over, and you want them to be the one that tips the coins on your own eyes. You want them to outlive you, and that kind of led to a lot of the most recent work, more so, but the sense of kind of what I pass down, what we pass down, what we can inherit, or what we gift to the ones who come after us.
So just following on from that, the title of the show is An Unbidden Quest, which I suppose could relate to being a mother, but it could also relate to the act of painting and the activity of painting, and maybe you could say something about where the title comes from and what these words, unbidden and quest, mean to you.
There's always, my figures have always had a sense of questing, of journeying, and when I was painting, I think it was this one, I was listening to Dr. Martin Shaw, who speaks, he's a kind of oral storyteller, historian, particularly on myth, and a lot on Dartmoor. He lives in the village next to the village I grew up in. And he was talking about the quest, and I was thinking about this quest figure, that it's generally male, traversing solo through wild landscape, you know, in search of a golden chalice or another kind of goal. And I was like, that all my quests are kind of unbidden, like painting. Nobody asks you to paint. Nobody, in my life, nobody's asked me to be a mother. You know, these are all kind of these frameworks almost for life that have come, yeah, have come unbidden. And I very much have felt like this mother is this kind of hero figure, this sort of relic of a hero figure in this kind of wild and desolate landscape, even as the world kind of journeys on and gets even more combined with technology. You return to this kind of primitive, singular mother who births children kind of ridiculously and endlessly and wonderfully.
Yes, yes. I mean, so I suppose they're quite, what you've said so far, there's a real sense of an emotional investment in painting, and maybe that's something that isn't often talked about as much as it was in the past. I think we've maybe spoken about it, and how these are, I suppose, an emotional response. And you mentioned this interiority. In the paintings, there's a sense of the inside, but also the outside. You were speaking there a little bit about the quest, the wild landscape, but it seems in these paintings that there is that interface or that boundary between the outside and the inside. And you grew up in Dartmoor, and so these is Dartmoor in these paintings?
Yeah, I mean, the one over there, that's really what I'd say is the first Dartmoor painting after almost 50 years. I finally painted one. I only just realised the other day that some people don't have an interior voice, which I had no idea, because my interior voice is, you know, wildly off the charts most of the time, and I think I found it very difficult to function in the world, you know, on a kind of practical level a lot of the time.
Does your interior voice, does that quieten down when you're painting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when I was getting the train up this morning, that I'll find a way back to your question in a minute, but like when I was a child and adolescent and before smartphones, that my favourite thing to do was to daydream. You know, I loved just returning to my bedroom and daydreaming, and it was like, oh, I found the kind of centre ground, and that's what the studio is for me. You know, I go in there and I'm like, everything kind of settles down. I can be, these are the closest paintings to my consciousness that I've ever made. So my sense of interiority and exteriority are, yeah, very acutely on the level together. And I think not that I've had to, but I have a lot of time in my life kind of squashed it down in order to survive. And when I'm able to go to the studio and bring it to the fore, then I can kind of survive the day-to-day of going to buy socks and, you know, all of those things you have to do. And like growing up on Dartmoor, yeah, it's quite, my village is on the edge of the high moor, so it's quite an extraordinary landscape that we were in the whole time. And it gave me a sense of kind of time as a kaleidoscope, that everything collapses and returns all at once, that, you know, you can be present and standing there, and you can be Bronze Age as well. You're playing on ruins that ancient people built or played upon, and, you know, you can't help but feel archaic.
And so, just you were talking there about getting into the studio and And then there's obviously the other aspect of like living and doing all that kind of stuff. How often do you get in the studio? What happens when you get in the studio? Do you have to try and find a way of getting into the zone? Do you do a lot of drawing?
Yeah, I mean, having a child completely changed my process of painting because you don't have any time really to ruminate. Your thinking time is done as you're walking to and from or in the middle of the night, or you don't really, in the past you would sit and light up a cigarette and look at your canvas. And I mean, I don't smoke for years, but that kind of situation, which you can't do, you have to go in and work. But it also taught me, because I had these very small gaps for a long time, it's changed a bit now because my daughter's in school, I realised things like that I really like it when paint dries. I'm not a wet on wet painter, apart from maybe some of the more gestural aspects. So it very much affected my process, and that because I had this, I'd say almost like 5 years of invisibility, I kind of, which I think many of us do when we're, got the early years of children, that they need you for their survival. But it meant that in the studio, I was able to accord the paintings time and give them the time they need and bring back a sense of time to a painting. It wasn't about getting it out in front of an audience. It was about making a painting work. So some of these were begun in kind of 21, 22, and then it's only really this summer the figures have kind of come in. I do draw now. I think this show, or I didn't make the work for the show, but the work I was doing shifted my process again, that I started to make small drawings and then small paintings for the figures. And then I work in a much more open way on the landscapes. And then when the landscapes are ready, then the figures come in. And that kind of allows me, with the, the small blocks of time that you have when you're, you've got to drop your child at school, you've got to get to the studio. And I drop quite easily into the zone of painting because I've been holding it back for, a long time. So I'm ready to go. But then, at 2 o'clock, you've got to clean up and go and pick somebody up again and be there for them. Yeah.
And are there different zones or different states of mind? So just because of the way that the paintings are approached, for example, in this one at the bottom, where it's much more this incremental mark making, and maybe slightly less descriptive than rendering the Brancusi head. Does your state of mind or just where you are psychologically or emotionally dictate maybe which parts of the painting you work on? Or is it much more kind of calculated where you think, today I have to do this top right corner?
No, it's not usually calculated. It's quite instinctual, but I do have a strong sense of balance. Like how as a painter emerges, I'm always thinking about balance. And I'm quite, although there's a lot of subject matter in my work, I'm quite a formal painter. I care about how it works, and I love that a painting can contain many paintings. We mentioned still life before, but not just that you can have heavy areas, empty areas, very thin, washed out areas, all of those working together. And I just kind of know. Yeah, but sometimes, we talked about that, didn't I? That sometimes I do Kundalini yoga, and I don't know if you've ever done it, but it's a lot of breath work, and I get pretty intense visions. And then I usually I saw that big half moon circle. I was like, okay, and so I just had to hold that as a kind of note in my head for when I could get back in the studio and paint that. Yeah.
With the one over there where you've left quite a lot of the canvas, and that seems to be quite different to a lot of the other ones in terms of what the paint is doing to occupy the space of the painting. So what was it did that just sort of come to you, or what led to that decision?
I like that it's closer to drawing, and I like the emptiness and the kind of breathing space you get in drawing. There are some empty, that top right's unpainted, and I usually feel happier when there's empty space as well. But I don't think these paintings just didn't allow for it. They were quite intense and crowded in. So I think that's probably more, if I've got the right scale canvas, I can allow for it to happen. Yeah, and some, even like the smaller works, they're not all painted in. There's empty areas, yeah. But I do like to retain drawing in my painting.
You mentioned there still life, and maybe we could say a little bit about other artists who perhaps inform the work, or artists that you look to. Are there certain artists in your mind that you keep coming back to throughout the periods that we've discussed, or did new artists emerge through the work that you've made recently?
When we took,
Did we mention Cézanne?
Yeah, we took
Beckman.
That was it, because we were talking about because in lockdown, or just after lockdown, when it opened up and everyone was getting to go to shows, and I don't live in London, and my responsibilities meant I couldn't really come up and go and see shows all the time, and I was like, I felt this great envy, and I had to let go of the envy of seeing people living vicarious painting lives. And there was particularly a Braque still life show.
Yes, Bernard Jacobson.
Yes. And I kept saying, I was like, oh my gosh, that's the most beautiful looking painting, but I couldn't get to go and see it. But I kept thinking about the still life, that actually when you're parenting, the still life's all around you. It's not in this singular canvas out on its own, it's on the table. It's the food you give your child, it's the sustenance. And I kind of wanted to restore the still life into the bigger painting. But I think that I just returned to looking in books because I couldn't. And I was like, you know what? All the painting I love from early 20th century, they only looked in books, if that, or folios. Nobody had access to hundreds and hundreds of images, and it kind of helped me simplify down. And early Cézanne I love, they're so clumsy and kind of brutal, and like Manet and the brusque kind of paint on the faces, and then because there's quite a lot of white. If you're painting white, you always look at Manet's clothes. And Beckman, one of the things I love about Beckman is that you're so convinced by the painting, by the figures, by the space, yet none of it's real. It's totally fantastical, but you believe in it wholeheartedly. And I was talking to somebody else about this to try and explain this kind of. People talk about a right side of your brain and your left side of your brain, which I get my right and left mixed up, so it doesn't make sense. But I always felt like I had this perceptual side and then this kind of heavy weighted kind of figure side. And it's like having, Beckman and, I don't know, like Joe Mitchell, sitting on your shoulders together, or like in a contemporary sense, like say, like I loved the Andreas Eriksson show at Stephen Friedman. That was so beautiful, but then equally, I love the Danica Lundy at White Cube, it was Cube it was, yeah. And like those to me, like those are equal and opposite. They don't have a value judgment on them, but they both exist in me really fully, that kind of my response to them. And so that's a lot of what, I think is just now I'm comfortable going forward in painting.
So with, for example, in this one, there's a little still life that's just been drawn in the bottom corner, is that something that would come from actual life, that you would maybe take it from your living room or your kitchen, or would it maybe come from, say, a Manet painting or a Cézanne painting? Does anything in the paintings come from other paintings, or is it all...
I don't think so. I think they just came from my imagination. But they were like, it wasn't there. And then I was like, you know what? I would never go out into the desert with my child if I didn't have a drink and a sandwich for them. And there's a kind of like, you know, bringing it back down to earth. That you wouldn't, it would be, that's the kind of reality of it.
So on the one hand, there's this slightly maybe metaphysical, dreamlike space, but then also something quite kind of mundane, very grounded.
Yeah.
The bowl of fruit, the candles, the view out the window.
Yeah, that's ordinary life, and you know, it's taken from ordinary. They're not. I didn't see them as hugely mythical, or they're certainly not. I'm not a very esoteric person. They are taken from my sense of being and what I'm just seeing around me. Yeah.
And so before the talk, I was just going through your Instagram, just for a bit of research. And in one of the posts, something that you said, painting is a love language. And that really sort of struck with me. And just, I'd been reading The Love of Painting by rereading The Love of Painting by Isabel Grave. And maybe you could just say something about, or to expand on that statement, painting as a love language.
I mean, I don't know if it's a kind of unfashionable thing to talk about love, but, you know, I love painting. I love going to the studio. I don't have that anxiety that, you know, painters, I hear people talk about, like, really happy there. But also that it all comes from a place of love, that I wouldn't want to bring anything into the world that's come from anything calculated. I don't know if I'm going to explain this in the way I want to. I think that, you know, the pursuit of it, it's a kind of fool's pursuit as well, you know. I'm almost 50 and this is my first solo show in London. It's like, I've got to be painting from love. I'm not painting from anything else. I'm painting for the sake of doing it. I always knew I was an artist since I was, you know, kind of 5 years old. And it's kind of love that gets you through in the world.
As you mentioned, like you said, fool's pursuit there. I'm just thinking, could that have been another title for the show? Unbidden Quest, Fool's Pursuit.
A fool's pursuit, it is.
Essentially the same thing.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of fooling in my work. I was very earlier on, probably when I encountered Marcus and Turps, I was really interested in the upside down world, the upside down body, and the woman, the female, the fooling position of being female in itself. And I think that that's softened. I think I used to paint a lot about sentiment, and then it's taken me a while to bring a child into the work because it's seen as sentimental when it's like I didn't really need to paint about sentiment anymore because I had this incredibly powerful force of love in my world that I could work through.
And what do you feel now when you're sort of sitting here and the paintings are surrounding you? Are you surprised by them? Did they look how you imagined they would look when you were in the studio painting them?
I think one thing that's great is that you never, I mean, maybe if you have a really big fancy studio, you can get a distance. But I'm painting them up quite close. But when I'm painting, I'm always, my sense of them is, 20 foot away as well as close up. So my mind is making that happen, and to be able to them to be in a space so you can see them at the distance, so that the marks merge and form full forms. But then when you come close, you see how they're constructed as paintings, which is probably what painters do. We stand and look at the edge of the canvas, don't we? But also that I've always worked within a sense of an open narrative, that the narrative is the connection between the works, and each one is its own event, its own story, so it doesn't need to totally resemble the one next to it.
Mm-hmm.
But the things like the pearls and the coins become the language that link them together.
Mm-hmm. And so, just thinking about, you are a painter,
Mm-hmm.
and you clearly love painting, as I think we have discussed. But you also are involved in Turps. So you, just to kind of almost bookend the talk, you did the Turps crit way back in 2017, and then you are now working at Turps as a mentor on the correspondence course, where people send you images in a letter, and then you write a letter back. So we're kind of maybe returning to this idea of painting as a love language. Maybe you could say a little bit about your experience of looking at someone else's paintings and writing about them, and what that gives you, what that affords you as a painter.
I love it. I mean, I think also because I feel a lot of pressure, like speaking to people, you know, and that sense of when you speak that you have to get it totally right. And one great thing about the correspondence course is you get either 5 or 3 times a year, you get, a folio of paintings that you then write about, you respond to. And I love writing, so it really suits my kind of processing, that I can kind of respond in an almost stream of consciousness, but then bring in, other painters. It might remind you of ideas to push work forward. Just so many things, but that. Right.
Would you say that you prefer to write about painting than to talk about it?
Well, I always think that, but actually when I start speaking, I'm all right. But I have found that what's lovely about working with somebody over a year is it's like you're kind of like a net for them. You kind of guide them over the year, and you know that you're just sort of holding it, and everything might drop. And a lot of people are going through quite intense times, even just with their painting, but in personal life as well. So you have a lot of responsibility. I did my first couple of years through lockdown, so I'm kind of shepherding people through lockdown. Like Susan's here, who was one of my lockdown mentees, and it's really nice. We've just met in person, so you never meet in person, and you think that you wouldn't be able to look on screen and understand a painting. But I think those of us who have been looking at painting for so long are pretty well versed in what works and what doesn't, and you can kind of make a guess. And we're so used to seeing paintings on the screen nowadays. It's
like what you were saying before about, during COVID, you would just have to look in books and monographs. So it's a kind of, sort of relying on reproductions.
Yeah, there's that. And I think encouraging people to write, encouraging painters to write is such a valuable contribution. I have a current mentee, and she gave me, first of all, this very kind of art speak sort of thing. And I was just like, oh, I don't want to read that. And I was like, it's not enough. I know there's more. And I contacted you at Turps. And then turned out she had like this whole incredible couple of pages of just her spilling it all out on the page. And then she sent me that. And since then, she's just been writing to me in her voice. And, and then the work is just getting so much more, it's getting so exciting. So I think also you help people find a written voice where they're not having to conform to a sense of how they should be writing.
I suppose my experience of it is that writing about painting then somehow feeds back into talking about painting, or it gives you your own vocabulary and the way that you might. So how you write about painting when you're there and you're having to spend the time trying to think of the right word or the right sequence of words, where you're trying to actually get at something quite specific, and having that time then means that when you are outside in the world, looking at paintings in galleries or having conversations with other painters, the words tend to come easier because you have that experience of trying to say something in writing, which you know is going to be perhaps more permanent than when you just utter things in conversation quite casually.
And you have to be really careful as well. Like you're like aware that these are. I didn't think about this at first, but they almost become like artifacts for people. Like I've had people writing to me and saying, "I've got your letter on my studio wall," or that I look at it, 4 years after we corresponded. That's a lot of responsibility, but that it's quite wonderful. But it means that you're very careful with how you write and how you think. You're not. I can't be anything cavalier about it. I mean, do you find it affects your own painting, like after you've done?
I think it just affects everything in some ways. Yeah, and it's something that you take with you out into the world. So you set the time aside to do it, but then also you're out going to see exhibitions or even just having dinner, and suddenly things. This person who I'm writing about, there'll be a spark or some kind of ember of something in your head. So it's this thing that, as you say, it becomes quite a responsibility.
Yeah.
In much the way that, painting is a responsibility and, being a parent is a responsibility. So, I mean, you mentioned something there about kind of spilling out. I just wondered, I wrote it down because I think, is there could that be a phrase or a term that you use to describe the paintings?
I don't know. I think of exploding. Maybe not so much.
Well, because the figure and the painting at the back, it is a figure that's made up of limbs and there's an arm and a head, but the body is made up of different components, and it's almost quite hard to give them a name. It could be something kind of combusting or flowering or scattering and imploding, exploding. So just a sort of spilling out, I suppose. Maybe that's why I wrote it down.
Yeah, you see, because that's probably not, spilling is probably not a language, I think, because that's quite goopy. It's quite a wet thing. And the paintings themselves are dry. When I made that one, I had this sense of this kind of flayed form, and I've seen like the écorché drawings, these flayed bodies. But I'm not interested in the kind of guts and interior of the body in that way. So when I was making this flayed form, I was thinking there's something kind of that's blooming in that breaking apart, and that's in the center. There's a myrtle flower. I used to do a lot of work connected with Aphrodite, which was really connected to Cythera, and a painting by Watteau called The Embarkation to and Departure from Cythera, where you don't know if the figures are going towards or away from this island. And it always seemed to me that was kind of about the nature of love, about the nature of painting, that there's, it's a mutable sensation. And so I had these botanical drawings, black and white botanical drawings of the myrtle, and I just kind of restored it to the center of that figure. And Aphrodite, maybe that comes back to the love language, Aphrodite's the figure of love. And when I started to think much more about Dartmoor and the canvas as a platform, I came across this word for, this was probably about 4 years ago, this word for temenos, which describes Aphrodite's temple space, that there was a outdoor space for worship. And I was like, that's what the canvas is. That's what Dartmoor is. That's what the nature of painting is. It's this hermetic, sealed space, which over these past 5 years, I closely aligned to the experience of motherhood, that it was this hermetic, sealed space. And I don't know why it hasn't, motherhood hasn't been talked about as being very close to painting before, like the actual process of it, that it's this hermeticism, not in a mysticism, but in this sealed, circular site where it's full of experimentation and kind of wonder as well, and discovery. And, I went to art school at a time when there were still male painters saying that women couldn't paint because they had too many hormones. Which might be why I think of painting as a love language, because I think, the hormones are these wonderful things that make us paint wonderful paintings. And I wouldn't want to deny that. Yeah.
And do you think about it, just what you were describing there, about it being this hermetically sealed space, and then going back to how we started the conversation thinking about time, is it very kind of cyclical, that, there's no sort of end, no beginning and no end, it's just this thing that kind of circulates?
Yeah, I don't have a linear sense of time at all. And I think that's very much in these paintings. And I mean, even that one there is kind of day and night at once, and circularities in the circular motif, which has become stronger even in the paintings in the front room. There's always a return. You're always circling around.
And as you say, there are lots of circles, ovals, there's a kind of roundness to that's being depicted across multiple paintings, whether it's the head, the sort of egg-shaped Brancusi head, or the bowl of apples, or even just the shape of the palette shield.
Because you find that, that you think you're over something as a painter, and then suddenly 5-10 years later it sneaks up on you, and you're like, I can't. That's why you can't actually ever let things go.
Yeah.
You're always returning.
No escape. Speaking of no escape, now would be a good time to open it up to the audience to see if anyone has any comments or questions, speculations, thoughts. But yes, we do.
Can I just ask you this one? You mentioned this was Dartmoor later. So one reason I think I've kind of abandoned landscapes painting is because I find it really difficult to stand in, the landscape. I'm sort of overwhelmed by it, and sort of somehow convert that into a painting which is anything other than a kind of photograph. But so, can you sort of explain to us how you, or you perhaps can't, I know, so don't worry.
No, go on.
How you get that amazing painting from Dartmoor?
I mean, I think, that's one of the reasons I kept away from landscape for some time, was a lot of the time you just feel like you're making a picture, don't you? And it's a view. And not to paint a view is very hard. You have to paint an experience, a sensation. And I think that's, in a lot of these paintings, and in that one in particular, I felt like I was in the middle of a thicket, that I was in a gorse bush or something, and that's what started to happen in the bottom. And then I feel now I'm probably on the horizon a little bit more. But when I first, there's an earlier painting underneath, which was very strongly this kind of temenos space, and I kept painting. I said, no, I need to go back to Dartmoor. And it was just about horizons, that on Dartmoor there are lots of different horizons. You're never fixed. You're always kind of falling over the next hill. And as I painted it, I put in that little moon shape at the top, and I thought, it's night and day. So I was on the more above my village when it was the eclipse. What was that, 2022? Was that? I think when no, 2002, I mean, 2002, yeah, the big eclipse. And we could see beyond to Plymouth and then beyond to the sea and over the moor from where we are. But, we're in the middle of the moor and you could see the light. You could see the skies getting dark for miles and miles and the birds going quiet and then waking up again. And this whole traverse of time within this span. And I think that's why this kind of widescreen format as well has worked for me when I think about Dartmoor, because it has this kind of extension.
Sorry, I'll stop in a minute.
Carry on.
I was just interested in how you, sorry, I'm quite concrete. How do you go and sit there and do lots of drawings, or do you just kind of dream there and then write notes and then go back to the studio and then...
No, not at all. I think I know it in my bones, so I painted from there.
All right, okay, so
it's like I'm not...
You're not actually in the space, literally.
No, I don't. I go down there a lot. My family is still there, but I don't live. I wish I could live there, but I don't live there right now. Yeah, so it's my muscle memory. Yeah, my feeling. Yeah.
Which I guess maybe applies to how you paint everything in the pictures. It's, it's something to do with the experience of it that you can draw upon. So you're drawing upon something rather than drawing from it.
Yeah, definitely. And the figures as well. Like, I feel the weight of a body. I feel what a body needs to do. And sometimes I'll look for a reference if I need to. I kind of know the weight of it.
Yep.
Hi. I think, do I read somewhere that you write? So you do write. I don't know if you do poems and there's a relationship with this.
I used to. So when I was at the Royal College, I didn't really have a studio space, and so I just joined some poetry groups in London, and I was doing a lot of performance poetry with like Apples and Snakes, and like there were a lot of kind of people like Amy Key and people who are all, kind of quite well-known poets, Emily Berry now, and I used to do a lot of poetry with them, with Roddy Lumsden, and I've written a lot, wrote a novel and stuff like that, but what I love about poetry is how akin to painting it is. I kind of think of a painting as that poetic moment where you can, allow language to take its own form, and it's as its whole is its meaning, that you don't have to understand it explicitly. I think probably like Ariana Rines, like I discovered her during lockdown, and like reading her writing has been, a kind of companion over the last couple of years.
That's interesting because just as I mentioned, I was reading the Love of Painting. In one of the very first chapters, she talks about how in the Renaissance, painting and language were much more or like painting and speech were much more kind of interconnected, and people thought they almost came from the same kind of place internally, and it was all to do with sort of persuasion. The painting is meant to persuade you much as speech is meant to persuade you. So, but I didn't realise you wrote a novel.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
And would you consider going back to writing, or is the correspondence course enough?
Kind of is at the minute, actually.
Is that sort of like scratches that itch that you might have to?
My Instagram captions and correspondence course. Yeah, I think I've had that split all my life, and sometimes the writing tries to take over, and then the painting always wins. And I think this last year is probably the only time that I haven't really written anything fictional or poetic. I've just written for Turpps or writing on my own work, and actually it's been a good thing. because I can be, I just take that sense into, I love language, but I think my paintings probably speak of somebody who loves language as well. Yeah.
Hey.
Very shocking, but I just been struck at how slowly paintings kind of reveal themselves. I have to keep going back to them and almost like looking at a landscape is not necessarily one way in or looking at foliage or so I don't know if that's something that is really intentional or just comes through in a very intuitive way.
I think it wasn't an intent, like I didn't have a dogma of that's what I'm going to do, but it evolved, and then I was like, yeah, that's, my work's pretty resistant to the screen. And that's what's been great about working with Greg to bring this to be in front of people's eyes, is that it is work that you sit with. And that kind of resistance becomes even more and more important to me every day, that in our lives, that resistance to the screen and to technology, but also the rewards of painting. Like, it doesn't need to be fast, it doesn't need to be consumed, it doesn't need to be just for the market, It's something that you want to live with, that, you uncover something new each time. And now that's very clear to me, now I'm kind of embedding that in the work I do. Yeah.